"Step away from the bag, ma'am. We've had reports." That's what they told her, in front of the entire cabin, as if she was a thief. No evidence. No missing item in sight. Just a black woman sitting in first class, quiet, composed, and wrong-looking in their eyes. They pulled her aside, searched her belongings, and whispered to one another, as if her presence itself required justification. Every act that followed was a warning dressed as protocol. Her seat reassigned to the back of the plane for security balance, her meal mysteriously skipped. Her name broadcast over the intercom as someone who needed to be detained upon landing. And still, she said nothing. Not because she was weak, but because she didn't have to explain herself to people who'd already decided who she was. What they didn't know: she owned the airline, and every insult, every sideways glance, every policy they bent to put her in her place was being documented for their final performance review. How would you react if your silence was mistaken for submission? If your skin made you guilty before a question was even asked? Drop your thoughts in the comments. What moment made your blood boil? And tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay until the end. Trust us, the twist is just getting started. The terminal gleamed with polished tiles and the soft murmur of first-class passengers checking in without a second glance. There was a certain rhythm to this world. Men in tailored suits tapping at their phones, women in silk blouses clutching designer handbags, and staff speaking in a practiced, quiet register reserved only for those who seemed to belong. The private terminal of Langford Aviation was no place for uncertainty. That's why when Zaria Monroe stepped through the frosted glass doors, the shift in atmosphere was palpable. She wasn't loud. She didn't stumble. She didn't wear anything outlandish. Her long navy trench coat hugged her tall frame, a muted beige scarf around her neck, modest gold jewelry adorning her ears. And yet, the silence that fell across the reception counter was heavy, unmissable. The receptionist blinked twice, then smiled, too tightly, too professionally. "Good afternoon. Are you with one of the bands? Instruments should be checked in at the back entrance. Crew entry is there too." She gestured vaguely toward a side hallway, without confirming anything. Zaria didn't flinch. Her soft brown eyes rested on the receptionist, steady and calm. "No, I'm flying today. First class," she said, holding out her boarding pass, which bore the logo of Langford Aviation with an understated shimmer and her name in bold. The woman took the pass, scanned it, paused, then looked back up with a practiced smile. "Oh, of course. My mistake." But the damage was already done. Zaria had grown used to moments like these, the soft abrasion of assumption cloaked in professionalism. At 33, she had performed cello in every major symphony hall across 5 continents. Her music had accompanied award-winning films. She had guest lectured at Juilliard, and last month, Forbes named her among the top 30 under 40 cultural icons. Still, the quiet question behind people's eyes was always the same. What are you doing here? She passed through security with ease, her travel bag checked in advance, her cabin bag rolling silently behind her. The walk to the private gate was quiet. The glass walls along the corridor reflected her composed expression and the smooth stride she carried with years of discipline. She wasn't early by chance. Zaria always arrived early, not just because punctuality mattered, but because arriving first meant fewer eyes watching her arrive. When she reached the gate, another staff member glanced up. Male, mid-40s, crisp uniform, warm but rehearsed smile. "Hello there," he said with a slight lilt. "You looking for the crew lounge? The team usually meets near Gate 4. Zaria lifted her boarding pass again, her smile not faltering. "I'm flying seat 1A. A brief flicker of confusion crossed the man's face before he corrected himself, tone switching. "Right, of course. Welcome aboard, Ms. Monroe." She nodded politely and stepped onto the luxury jet bridge. The air changing from industrial airport sent to a crisp citrus fragrance pumped through the ventilation system. The aircraft itself was state-of-the-art, with champagne gold finishes and privacy panels separating each first-class pod. The lighting was low, warm. A stewardess with platinum blonde hair approached. Her name tag read Cheryl. She glanced at Zarya's boarding pass, then at Zarya, then back again. "You're in 1A? Okay. That's right up front. May I?" She gestured to help with Zarya's bag, though her hand didn't quite reach for it. "I've got it," Zarya said softly, slipping the bag into the overhead bin with practiced ease. Cheryl gave a clipped nod, then walked away briskly without a word. The man across the aisle, dressed in a heather gray suit with a loosened tie, gave Zarya a half smile, then turned back to his iPad. She settled into her seat slowly, letting her fingers brush over the leather armrest, breathing in deeply. First class wasn't new to her, but it never quite felt like home. As she adjusted the lumbar support and reclined slightly, she noticed Cheryl whispering to another steward nearby, nodding subtly toward her seat. The two exchanged glances, Cheryl's expression unreadable, the other steward looking skeptical but neutral. Zarya turned her gaze out the window. The tarmac below bustled with carts, loaders, and the refueling crew. She noticed a man in a ground crew vest pause and look up at her window. For a moment, she thought he was staring at her. But then he shook his head and moved on. Zarya's phone buzzed gently in her lap. A text from her assistant, Jaden. "Everything confirmed. Zurich waiting. Good luck." She typed back a quick thumbs-up emoji and tucked the phone away. She had a performance to prep for, the Zurich Philharmonic's Winter Gala. It was a major event, months in the making, and this flight was meant to be her moment of calm before the storm. But calm wasn't in the air today. Another steward arrived with a tray of champagne flutes. He offered one to the man across the aisle, to the couple behind her, to the businesswoman reading a Kindle 3 rows down. When he got to Zarya's seat, his tray hesitated. "Would you prefer sparkling water instead?" he asked. The tone wasn't rude, just off, like someone trying not to say something they were thinking too loudly. "No," Zarya replied smoothly. "Champagne is perfect." He nodded, recovered his smile, and handed her a glass. She sipped quietly, the bubbles sharp on her tongue, and leaned back. The hum of low conversation filled the cabin. Seatbelt lights blinked above. No one was overtly hostile, but everything, the small delays, the alternate suggestions, the double takes, wrapped around her like fog. And she knew better than to ignore the weather when flying. A soft chime played as the captain's voice came on. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Langford Flight 724 to Zurich. We're expecting a smooth flight. Please relax and let us know if there's anything we can do to enhance your experience." Zarya didn't smile. She just adjusted her posture, crossed her legs, and prepared for what was never just a flight, but always a test. Zarya had just started to settle into the rhythm of the flight. The plane had leveled out, and the seatbelt sign had been switched off. She was reviewing her annotated score for the Zurich performance, eyes scanning each crescendo and glissando, trying to shut out the subtle tensions from earlier. Despite the rocky welcome, she told herself to focus. Just a few more hours, and she'd be in rehearsal. But then, a tremor of unease swept through the cabin like a silent signal. A hushed commotion began several rows behind her. A woman, elegantly dressed, with manicured hands and a powder blue Chanel suit, was turning around in her seat, clearly distressed. Her voice, initially restrained, started rising. "My bag is gone. It was right here. It had my jewelry, my passport. This is unacceptable." Passengers turned their heads, brows furrowed, and some whispered behind cupped hands. The cabin crew responded immediately. One steward leaned in to speak with the woman, while another began discreetly checking nearby overhead bins. Zarya glanced up, briefly curious but unconcerned. That changed when she noticed two crew members whispering while glancing toward her seat. Then it happened. Cheryl, the same stewardess from earlier, approached with the lead flight attendant, Robert Klein, at her side. His face was tight, practiced in corporate calm, but clearly serious. "Ms. Monroe," he said, voice low but not quite private, "I'm going to need you to come with me to the service galley. There's been an incident, and we'd like to ask you a few questions." Zarya blinked, confused but composed. "I'm sorry, what incident?" Robert's jaw tensed, his words clipped. "We'll explain in the galley. Please bring any personal belongings you have with you." Passengers nearby pretended not to look, but their eyes followed her as she rose from her seat. She took her carry-on from the overhead bin, her cello case long since stored separately, and walked beside Robert down the narrow aisle. As they entered the rear galley, the fluorescent lighting felt colder, more clinical than the warm ambience of first class. Cheryl closed the privacy curtain behind them, and Robert gestured for Zarya to place her bag on the steel prep counter. "There's been a report of a missing item," he began, folding his hands. "A high-value handbag, to be exact. The passenger seated in 4A has alerted us that it disappeared shortly after boarding. You were seated nearby." Zarya's brow furrowed. "I've been in my seat the entire time." Robert nodded, as if expecting that answer. "Yes, we reviewed the boarding logs. You boarded early. According to Cheryl, you walked down the aisle, paused briefly near row 4, and then proceeded to your seat. Is that correct?" Zarya inhaled slowly. "I stopped to check my seat number. That's all." "Are you implying I took someone's bag?" Cheryl stepped forward slightly, adding, "You seemed hesitant. We noticed that. And this flight is secure. No one else passed through that row until boarding was complete." Zarya felt her pulse rise, but kept her tone measured. "I hesitated because I was being questioned repeatedly by your staff. And I don't think looking hesitant is enough to accuse someone of theft." Robert's voice dropped lower, more serious now. "Ms. Monroe, please understand, this isn't a personal accusation. We're simply doing our due diligence. But you're the only passenger who passed that row unsupervised. We'd like your cooperation. Would you mind if we inspect your belongings?" Zarya looked at both of them, eyes narrowing. "I absolutely mind. Unless you have a warrant or probable cause, I'm not opening anything." Cheryl stiffened. Robert sighed. "I was hoping we could keep this simple. Look, we're not trying to escalate this. But we have protocols. Security will be waiting when we land in Zurich. Unless we can resolve this now." Zarya's gaze didn't waver. "You're saying if I don't comply, I'll be detained?" Robert's tone turned colder, more pragmatic. "If you have nothing to hide, this should be quick. Just open the bag, and we can move on." The room shrank around her. She wasn't just being asked. She was being cornered. She thought of a woman in the Chanel suit, sobbing quietly a few rows away. Of the quiet eyes watching her as she was escorted to the back. Of the weight of accusation without evidence. She placed her bag on the counter. Slowly, deliberately, she unzipped it. Cheryl leaned in slightly, eyes hawk-like, ready to pounce. Zarya opened the flap, revealing sheet music, a leather-bound notebook, her phone charger, and a travel-sized bottle of lotion. No handbag. No jewelry. No passport that wasn't her own. Cheryl glanced toward Robert, who frowned, clearly annoyed. "That's fine. Now, the side pocket." Zarya didn't move. "Do I look like a thief to you?" she asked, her voice level but razor-sharp. Cheryl flinched. "We're not saying that," she replied quickly. "But appearances can be deceiving. And you've been evasive." Robert folded his arms. "I think we're done here for now. You can return to your seat, Ms. Monroe. But understand, we're still required to make a report." Zarya zipped her bag back up and slung it over her shoulder. As she stepped past them toward the curtain, Cheryl added under her breath, "If you're honest now, we can recommend against prosecution. That's all we're trying to say." Zarya froze, slowly turned. "Are you threatening me with criminal charges for being the wrong person in the wrong seat at the wrong time?" Robert held up a hand, attempting to defuse. "Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." But it was already big. It wasn't about a missing purse anymore. It was about a pattern, a chain of microaggressions that now escalated into a formal suspicion. She walked back down the aisle, the stares this time more blatant. Someone leaned toward their partner and whispered. Another shifted slightly away as she passed. Zarya felt their unspoken questions hit her like cold gusts. Did she do it? Why else would they call her back there? She reached her seat, sank into it without a word, and stared ahead, the champagne still untouched on her tray. Her fingers curled tightly around the armrest. The cello, silent and stored somewhere in the cargo hold. had never felt so far away. The cabin lights dimmed for the meal service. A new steward came down the aisle, offering warm towels. When he reached her, he paused, unsure, then moved on without saying a word. Zarya closed her eyes. She could hear her father's voice again. "You don't get to mess up, baby. Not even once. Not when they're watching you this close." She took a deep breath, but this time it didn't calm her. It only made the fire sharper. She opened her eyes again. Something had shifted. And then, a new voice crackled through the intercom, calling for the lead flight attendant. There had been a development, one that would ripple through the next hours like a fuse already lit. The silence surrounding Zarya's seat was no longer neutral. It had morphed into suspicion, thick and suffocating. She could feel it tightening around her like invisible rope. Every time a flight attendant passed, their gaze lingered just a second too long. The man in 2C, who had earlier offered her a casual smile, now avoided eye contact entirely, adjusting his AirPods as if retreating into music would protect him from the discomfort brewing in the cabin. Zarya sat still, composed, but her thoughts were a storm. She replayed Robert's tone, Cheryl's insinuation, the way they spoke like facts were optional, but their suspicion wasn't. She wanted to scream, to demand they check the security logs, the timestamps, the seating manifests. But she didn't. Not yet. Not when everything was still a game of appearances. Then came the knock, light but firm, on her seat divider. She looked up. A different steward now, this one with a name tag that read Elliot. He didn't smile. "Ms. Monroe," he began, his voice low, bureaucratic, as if reading from a manual. "A passenger has come forward with a statement that may be relevant to the earlier situation." Zarya tilted her head slightly. "A passenger?" He nodded once, mechanically. "Yes. A Mr. William Hargrove. He stated he saw you near row 4, around the time of boarding." Zarya narrowed her eyes. "And that's supposed to mean what?" Elliot didn't answer immediately. He said you paused at the overhead bins, long enough to suggest interaction. The words were delivered without emotion, but the implication landed like a slap. "So now a stranger's hunch becomes evidence?" she asked. "Does he have a photo? A timestamp? Anything other than his assumptions?" Elliot shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "He's a frequent flyer. Platinum status. His statement will be recorded as part of the formal report." Zarya let out a low, disbelieving exhale. "Let me guess. He didn't see anyone else pause near that bin, did he?" Elliot hesitated for a moment too long. "We're just gathering all perspectives, Ms. Monroe." Not 10 minutes later, another announcement came over the speaker, this time in code. The kind most passengers ignored, disguised in flight language meant to avoid panic. But Zarya wasn't just any passenger. She'd flown often enough to know that phrase, requesting Delta 2 to front cabin, passenger coordination required. That was protocol for summoning airport law enforcement upon landing. Or worse, Midair intervention if necessary. Zarya sat motionless, her fingers digging into her armrest now. She didn't move when Cheryl returned, this time accompanied by another man, taller, broader, and wearing a navy blazer with silver lettering that read Sky Marshal. "Ms. Monroe," the man said with no attempt at pretense, "we're going to ask you to come with us. You are not under arrest. But for safety and compliance, we need to separate you from the cabin temporarily. Please bring your belongings." The words came in the calmest, most collected tone possible. But everything about the situation screamed escalation. Passengers were now fully aware. Heads turned, necks craned, and murmurs erupted like small tremors. Zarya stood, slowly, her bag over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. She followed them silently, past the first-class divider, through the business section, and finally into the aircraft's secondary crew area near the rear lavatories. They led her into a small enclosed service bay typically used for restocking supplies or private crew conversations. Now, it became an interrogation chamber. "You'll need to place your phone on the counter," the Sky Marshal instructed. "It will be returned to you shortly. We're just trying to keep the process streamlined." Zarya raised a brow. "I'm not even allowed to have my phone." He met her eyes. "This is standard procedure for any suspected in-flight incident, that involves potential theft or tampering. It protects both you and the integrity of the process. She didn't move. "You're afraid I'll record you," she said flatly. He didn't deny it. She placed the phone on the counter. The marshal slid it into a padded pouch and zipped it closed. "Now," he continued, "before we proceed, we need your signature on this document." He pulled out a single-page form from a clipboard. It was dense, filled with legal jargon, but the bolded title was clear: Voluntary Consent TO Property Search and Cooperation Form. Zarya scanned the page quickly, her instincts flaring. "Voluntary," she repeated. "If I say no, what happens?" The marshal maintained his neutral posture. "We'll still follow due process, but it may involve detainment upon landing and a request for federal authorization to search your belongings." She let the silence stretch. The hum of the engine now felt louder than ever, the subtle vibrations in the wall behind her echoing in her bones. "So it's voluntary, the same way walking the plank is voluntary when there's a sword at your back," she muttered. "I assure you," the marshal said, his voice still smooth, "this isn't personal. We're just following protocol." Zarya took the pen, hovered it over the paper, then looked him straight in the eye. "And how many passengers on this flight have you ever asked to sign one of these?" He said nothing. That was answer enough. She signed. Sharp, quick strokes. She didn't even recognize her own handwriting anymore. "Very well," the marshal nodded. "We'll proceed shortly. In the meantime, I recommend you stay seated here. Please remain calm. Someone will be with you shortly." They left her alone in that cold, metallic space. The walls were bare except for an emergency checklist taped beside the electrical panel. Her carry-on bag sat in the corner, untouched, for now. Zarya rested her back against the wall, letting her head gently bump the surface behind her. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint laughter of a flight attendant in the galley. The absurdity of it all hit her suddenly. She, a world-class artist, forced into a holding bay because someone thought she looked like she might have stolen something. And someone else, a platinum status frequent flyer with no proof, had pointed a finger. And that was enough. Enough to lose her phone. Enough to be moved like cargo. Enough to be made small. She didn't cry. That wasn't her. But her fingers began to tremble as they rested in her lap. The cello, the symphony in Zurich, the days of meticulous preparation. It all felt far away now, like a dream receding behind layers of fog and insult. And then she heard the curtain slide open again. Footsteps. Not hurried, but deliberate. Different shoes. Heavier. Authority. Someone new had arrived. But this time, they weren't wearing a crew uniform. The footsteps stopped just outside the galley, and before Zarya could even look up to identify the approaching figure, a voice she hadn't yet heard broke the low mechanical hum of the aircraft's mid-flight lull. It was clipped, professional, and carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. "Ms. Monroe, you'll be moved to a different seat." She looked up to see another uniform, this time a red-accented blazer, a supervisor, possibly an onboard security liaison. The man didn't smile, didn't ask, didn't offer an explanation that felt anything like humane. "You'll be seated in the last row of the aircraft," he continued. "Standard procedure in cases where a passenger status is pending further clearance. It's about minimizing disturbance and maintaining flight integrity." Zarya blinked slowly, her mind running the words back. Passenger status pending further clearance, as if she were a data point, not a human being. "My seat is in first class. I paid for it. I've done nothing wrong," she said, her voice low but steel-edged. The man, who introduced himself only as Supervisor Adams, didn't blink. "We're not questioning your payment. This isn't about your ticket. It's about optics and compliance. It's not personal." She almost laughed at that. It felt personal. Every step since boarding had made sure of that. "You're telling me I have to move because someone thinks I look suspicious?" she asked, folding her arms, still seated. Adams responded with a bland, bureaucratic tone. "You've already signed a consent form regarding this incident. That includes cooperation with seating adjustments deemed necessary by onboard personnel." Zarya's jaw tightened. She hadn't read that line. Maybe it was buried in the sea of fine print. Maybe it didn't matter. Because, apparently, signing a single piece of paper had given them license to treat her like a threat. Without waiting for further debate, Adams signaled to Cheryl, who appeared moments later with a laminated seating chart. "Row 35C is available," Cheryl said, her voice falsely sweet. "We'll escort you there now. Please bring your belongings." Zarya stood up slowly, each motion deliberate, her chin held high. She picked up her bag, didn't say a word, and followed Cheryl down the aisle. Passengers watched as she passed, some pretending to sleep, others openly curious. No one said anything, not even a whisper in her defense. When she reached the back of the aircraft, it felt like she had stepped into a different reality. The air back here was warmer, more crowded, the hum of conversations and clinking glasses long gone. The seat, narrow, rigid, with no extra cushioning or amenities, felt like a punishment in itself. She placed her bag beneath the seat and sat with her back straight, refusing to slouch or fold inward, even as her dignity felt like it was being sliced away piece by piece. Time passed in strange intervals. Her watch was still on New York time, and the flight tracker on the screen ahead was too blurry from her angle to read clearly. She kept her gaze forward, unmoving, trying to regulate her breath. Every time the curtain to first class shifted open in the distance, a flicker of memory stabbed her chest. That was supposed to be where she belonged. Then came the meal service. She saw the carts begin their slow progression forward from the front of the plane, weaving row by row. The smell of warm bread, herb-seasoned chicken, saffron rice drifted through the cabin. The man beside her lowered his tray, clearly anticipating the usual luxury offerings. A young female flight attendant, different from Cheryl, more reserved, maybe newer, pushed the cart toward their row. She smiled softly at the man, handed him a tray, and then her eyes landed on Zarya. The smile faded. She checked a list pinned to her cart, then looked up. "Ms. Monroe?" she asked quietly. Zarya nodded. "I'm sorry," the attendant said, not meeting her eyes. "We've been instructed not to serve anything to your row." Zarya stared at her. "I beg your pardon?" The attendant's fingers fidgeted on the cart handle. "It's just precautionary. There's the flag on your file. Security protocol states we minimize contact until the situation is resolved." "A flag," Zarya repeated, her voice dangerously calm. "What kind of flag justifies denying someone food on an international flight?" The attendant didn't answer. She simply pushed the cart forward, cheeks flushed. The man beside Zarya gave her a look, half sympathy, half fear that acknowledging her too much might draw unwanted attention to himself. He unfolded his napkin and began eating. No water, no tray, no explanation, just another cut. Hours passed like fog. Zarya's stomach ached, not just from hunger, but from the gnawing injustice of it all. Her only sustenance was the quiet fire she kept stoking in her mind. One word repeating itself over and over: document. She would remember everything. The tone, the silence, the sequence, the faces. Especially the faces. At some point, Cheryl returned, not with food, not with water, but with a clipboard. "There's a post-landing incident form you'll need to fill out," she said, holding it out. "It's mandatory if you want to avoid delays with customs upon arrival." Zarya didn't take it. "Why would I cooperate with a system built to humiliate me?" Cheryl's lips thinned. "Because refusing would imply you're hiding something. That was the game, wasn't it? Always tilted. Always lose-lose." "I'll review it after I eat," Zarya said, voice cool. Cheryl tilted her head, condescending. "As I said, we're not authorized to, then I'm not authorized to sign anything." Her tone sliced through the stale air, sharp enough to silence the row. Cheryl blinked, stepped back, and left. The lights in the cabin dimmed for rest. Zarya didn't sleep. Couldn't. She sat upright, jaw clenched, her body locked in a quiet resistance. Every moment in that seat stretched into something beyond time, beyond dignity. Then, sometime later, minutes, hours, she couldn't tell, the intercom clicked on again, but this time it wasn't the captain's voice. It was another woman's. Unfamiliar, measured. And as soon as she said the next sentence, Zarya's spine straightened instantly. The voice on the intercom had barely finished, speaking before Zarya knew something was about to shift again. It was an announcement directed at her, not this time. Not yet, but the tone was different, more clipped, and it signaled that someone new had entered the chain of decisions that governed her dignity midair. She didn't flinch. Instead, she rested her arms atop her tray table, empty except for a single water cup she had managed to retrieve earlier when a younger, more timid flight attendant had dared to sneak her one. Her stomach still gnawed hollow, but she didn't ask again. There were worse hungers now carving through her. Hunger for fairness, for air not tainted by judgment, for a moment where her identity wasn't a silent crime. The man sitting beside her had been relatively quiet since she'd been moved. Middle-aged, maybe late 50s, with a soft paunch beneath his travel blazer and the kind of loafers that gleamed too clean for a long-haul flight. He hadn't made eye contact before, but now that the cabin had quieted again, his curiosity outweighed his discomfort. So, he said suddenly, with that conversational tone people use when they pretend neutrality but drip intent beneath their words, "You're a musician?" Zarya didn't look up. Yes. He shifted in his seat, tilting slightly toward her. "I heard one of the crew say you went to Juilliard. That true?" She turned slightly, surprised. "I studied in New York, yes." The man whistled, a low, dismissive sound. "Must have been some ride getting in. Was it diversity-based? You know, affirmative action and all that?" Zarya didn't respond right away. She let the question hang, suspended in the cold, dry cabin air between them. Then, she turned fully toward him. "I earned my seat there," she said simply. "And every seat since." The man chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "I mean no offense. It's just, you know how things are these days. Everyone's trying to prove something. Sometimes it's not about talent anymore. It's about ticking boxes." Her jaw flexed. "Funny. I never had to wonder what boxes you tick to get where you are." That shut him up for a moment. He turned his gaze forward, stiffly flipping through the in-flight magazine, but the damage was done. Zarya leaned back against the window, her temple pressed to the cool wall. That exchange wasn't new. She'd heard variations of it on stages, in green rooms, even at donor dinners where she was the evening's entertainment but never quite the guest. But hearing it here, after everything else, was another needle under the skin, not deep enough to bleed, but sharp enough to sting. As the cabin lights shifted to a lower, bluish hue for nighttime rest, Zarya reached up to press the attendant call button. She needed a blanket. The cold was no longer just metaphorical. Moments later, footsteps approached. Cheryl, of course. She appeared from behind the curtain like some specter summoned by discomfort. "Yes?" she asked, arms crossed as if Zarya had asked for a security clearance rather than a blanket. Zarya kept her voice level. "Could I get a blanket, please?" Cheryl raised an eyebrow, glanced around as if the request needed confirmation. "We have limited extras. Most passengers requested them earlier." Zarya gestured lightly. "I didn't have access to request earlier. I'd like one now." Cheryl didn't move. "Well," she said, with the faintest smirk, "you know, we've had issues with items disappearing from cabins recently. So I'll just note your name with the inventory number, just for protocol." Zarya blinked. "Excuse me." Cheryl kept smiling. "Don't take it personally. It's just easier to keep track that way." Zarya's lips parted, but no words came. Not because she had nothing to say. She had too much to say. But none of it would land. Not here. Not now. "Fine," she said finally. "Note it. Log it. Frame it if you want. Just bring the damn blanket." Cheryl's smile faltered for half a second. Then she nodded and walked away. A few rows ahead, someone giggled. Not at her, maybe. Or maybe entirely at her. It didn't matter. It was one more layer of rot in the fabric of this flight. The blanket came 5 minutes later, still warm from the storage compartment. Cheryl didn't speak when she handed it over. Zarya unfolded it with slow, precise motions, laid it over her legs, and wrapped her arms tightly around herself. Not for comfort, for containment. The overhead lights dimmed again. The man beside her had drifted off, his head tilted to the side, soft snores rising. Zarya stayed awake, Her mind traveled back to her final audition in New York years ago, when her cello case had cracked open in front of the admissions panel and one of the judges, an older white man in horn-rimmed glasses, had looked at her and said, "We don't get many of your kind here. I hope you surprise us." She had. But now, it felt like she was still auditioning. For every seat, every glance, every right to exist without pre-approval. She reached into her bag quietly, pulling out her score again, not to study it, but to hold it. It was hers. No one had given it to her. She had earned the ink on every page. But tonight, it felt like a secret no one would believe. And then, above the drone of the engines and the steady breathing of hundreds of strangers, another sound emerged, soft, controlled footsteps heading her way. Someone else was approaching, but this time it wasn't crew. The engines began their gradual descent hum, a familiar low vibration signaling the plane's slow approach toward Zurich International Airport. Overhead lights shifted from sleep mode to a gentle white glow, and the cabin stirred back to life. Passengers stretched, readjusted neck pillows, and began gathering scattered belongings. Flight attendants moved efficiently through the aisles, collecting trash, offering final instructions, speaking with the clipped urgency of a landing checklist. Zarya, still seated in the back row, hadn't moved. She sat with the blanket folded neatly across her lap, hands resting on top of it, her cello score tucked back into her bag, though she hadn't turned a page since she opened it. She watched the window as clouds drifted like fading curtains, revealing patches of dark Swiss terrain beneath a violet morning sky. She could feel the ache of fatigue behind her eyes, but sleep had long abandoned her. Then Cheryl's voice came over the intercom, clear and neutral at first, but then sharpened with a peculiar precision. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we prepare for landing, please ensure your seat belts are fastened and trays are in the upright position. Upon arrival, we kindly ask that passengers remain seated until instructed to disembark." There was a pause, and then her tone shifted, still polite but focused. "Additionally, we would like to ask Ms. Zarya Monroe to remain on board briefly after landing, as airport authorities would like to speak with her in regard to a private inquiry." Zarya blinked. She hadn't expected it to be announced over the intercom. Not a tap on the shoulder, not a quiet request, but broadcast to the entire plane like a scheduled detainment. Her name, clear, unmistakable, carried across hundreds of heads that now turned in synchronized rhythm toward the back of the cabin. Some subtly, some openly, all with the same shared look, that slight raise of the eyebrows, the quick narrowing of suspicion, that unmistakable shift from anonymity to accusation. A mother across the aisle clutched her toddler closer. The businessman 2 rows ahead whispered to his seatmate. The man beside Zarya, who had earlier questioned her education, now sat stiffly upright, no longer feigning sleep, suddenly reminded of her presence, as if proximity itself could be dangerous. Zarya didn't react. She didn't ask why. She didn't protest. Her back remained straight, her gaze forward, but her fists beneath the blanket had curled into slow, tight knots. As the wheels made contact with the runway, the slight jolt through the fuselage did nothing to break the weight pressing down on her chest. The moment the seatbelt sign dinged off, everyone stood. Overhead bins clicked open like popcorn, passengers stretching arms to pull down briefcases and backpacks, the choreography of disembarkation playing out with practiced ease. But not for Zarya. She remained seated as instructed, not because she wanted to, but because she'd learned long ago that defiance only fed their narrative. She watched the plane slowly empty, row by row, section by section, until only a few remained. Cheryl reappeared near the rear galley, clipboard in hand, her eyes scanning the final rows until they landed on Zarya. She didn't speak. She just nodded, confirming that the delay had gone according to plan. Zarya stood quietly, adjusted her jacket, picked up her bag, and waited in the aisle. One last couple remained, an older woman and her husband, both dressed in understated gray. As the woman stood and turned to retrieve her coat, a sudden clatter hit the cabin floor. A slim leather wallet had slipped from her armrest and landed beneath the seats. The woman gasped. "My wallet," she cried, crouching instinctively to look for it. Zarya saw it first. A few inches to her left. She bent slowly, carefully, reached beneath the seat, and picked it up. "Here," she said, extending it politely. But before the wallet even left her hand, the woman recoiled slightly, her face tightening. Her husband, who had just turned around, saw Zarya's outstretched hand and raised his voice. "Hey, what are you doing with that?" he barked, loud enough to catch Cheryl's attention. "That's ours." Zarya froze, arms still extended. She dropped it. "I was handing it back." But the man didn't care. His face flushed with a sudden, self-righteous authority. "It fell, and you were reaching under there. I saw it." Cheryl stepped forward immediately, eyes narrowing, body stiff. "Ms. Monroe, is there a problem?" Zarya didn't answer. She simply placed the wallet down on the seat between them and took a step back. Her voice was low but unwavering. "I was returning it. That's all." The older woman looked embarrassed now, but said nothing. Her husband, however, wasn't done. "Well, sure looked like something else. After everything else on this flight, how are we supposed to know?" Zarya's mouth opened slightly, the beginnings of a reply forming, but no words came out. There was no point. Nothing she said would change what they'd seen, or rather, what they chose to see. Not a helpful gesture, not a moment of decency, but a potential theft, a repeat offense, a confirmation of bias. Cheryl stepped in again. "I'll handle it from here, sir," she said tightly, but not out of defense. More to contain the optics. Then she turned to Zarya. "Please follow me." Zarya walked behind her, each step down the now empty aisle echoing louder than the last. She passed the seats where she had once tried to rest, where she had once tried to exist without offending anyone, and now every fabric, every armrest, every flickering monitor seemed like part of the machinery designed to dismantle her dignity. The front of the plane was quiet now. Just past the cockpit door, the forward galley had been converted into a temporary holding space. And there, waiting beside the open hatch and the retractable stairs, were two uniformed officers in Zurich airport security colors, dark navy coats, utility belts, clipped radios at their shoulders. One of them held a slim folder. The other nodded as Cheryl approached. She gestured toward Zarya. "This is the passenger in question." Zarya said nothing. She stopped 3 feet from them, her breath even, her eyes unblinking. The taller officer stepped forward, opened the folder, and began to speak. The taller officer opened the folder with a deliberate slowness that suggested authority, but also a hint of routine. His eyes skimmed the page inside, and when he looked up at Zarya, his expression remained neutral, unaffected by the tension thickening the air around them. "Ms. Monroe," he began in a calm Swiss accent, "we've received a report concerning an in-flight incident involving personal property. As a precautionary measure, we're required to ask you a few questions and confirm your identity with airport customs. This is standard procedure." Zarya didn't respond immediately. She stood still, hands at her sides, her eyes flicking once toward Cheryl, who stood to the left like a sentry who'd completed her assignment and was now waiting for the consequences to unfold. The second officer, shorter but stockier, moved slightly forward and held out a small digital scanner. "Please provide a form of identification," he said. "Passport if available." Zarya reached slowly into her handbag, not with the tremble of someone cornered, but with the precision of someone who had waited for this exact moment. The leather wallet she drew out was smooth, dark, unadorned, and when she opened it, her fingers moved past her passport deliberately, bypassing the standard government IDs and credit cards, and instead plucking a matte black rectangle no larger than a driver's license. She held it between her fingers and extended it toward the officer without a word. The card was weighty, not just in physical texture, but in the silence it created. The diamond-etched text caught the overhead lighting just enough to shimmer. "Langford Aviation Board Executive Oversight Member." Underneath that, in smaller print, "Zarya Monroe, Senior Stakeholder." The officer took it, frowned slightly as he examined the raised seal, then tapped it lightly against the scanner on his tablet. A small chime sounded, and within seconds, the screen displayed an encrypted signature check, followed by a confirmation badge in deep blue. His eyes widened only slightly, but it was enough. Cheryl stepped forward, peering over his shoulder, and then visibly recoiled. "Is that?" she began, but her voice cracked midway. Zarya, still silent, took the card back without a word and returned it to her wallet. Then she reached again, slower this time, almost theatrically, and retrieved a neatly folded document, sealed in an executive-grade envelope with the embossed LAV insignia. Langford Aviation Ventures. She broke the seal, unfolded it in plain view of the officers and Cheryl, then held it up at chest height for all to see. It was the original letter of confirmation, signed by the chairman of Langford Aviation's global board, dated exactly 7 days prior. The text was formal, decisive. "We are pleased to confirm that Ms. Zarya Monroe has assumed a primary stakeholder position within Langford Aviation Holdings, representing controlling interests as of this date. She is granted full authority to audit, restructure, or review internal policy and personnel at her discretion." Her name appeared again at the bottom, directly above the words "Authorized Governance." Tier 1. The shorter officer blinked. The taller one cleared his throat. Cheryl took a full step back. "I assume," Zarya finally said, her voice cool and smooth as glass, "this will be sufficient to confirm my identity." Her tone wasn't smug. It wasn't even angry. It was something far more dangerous in that moment. Unshaken. The taller officer nodded, nearly bowing. "Yes, of course. We'd apologize for the inconvenience. We were unaware of your status, Ms. Monroe." Cheryl opened her mouth, trying to form words, but all that emerged was a faint gasp. She turned toward the officers as if waiting for them to step in, to deny what they'd just seen, to reverse reality with a procedural override. But nothing came. Zarya turned her eyes to her. "It's fascinating," she said quietly, "how quickly authority changes hands when the title fits the expectation. If I'd shown you this card on the plane, what would have happened?" Cheryl didn't answer. She couldn't. Zarya took a step closer, folding the letter slowly and returning it to the envelope. "You thought you understood who I was because of how I walked, because of my skin, because I didn't announce who I was the second I boarded. But what you didn't understand," she continued, her voice still quiet but now edged with steel, "is that sometimes silence is the most powerful room in the house." The officers exchanged a glance. The shorter one moved to the side slightly, making space between the exit stair and Zarya's path. The taller one gestured gently. "Ms. Monroe, we can escort you to the private customs office if you prefer. No lines. Direct clearance." Zarya shook her head once. "No. I'll disembark with the rest of the passengers. I'd rather not be separated any further." She began to walk forward. Cheryl stepped aside, almost tripping over herself as she moved to clear the way. Zarya passed her without another word. When she reached the top of the stairs, the wind outside was brisk, sharp, and strangely invigorating. Below, the tarmac bustled quietly with morning activity. But before she descended, she paused and turned slightly toward the officers. "By the way," she said, "the passenger in row for who reported the missing bag, tell her to check under her seat. It was never stolen, just slid during takeoff. I saw it while I was moved to the back." The officers nodded, stunned. She nodded once in return, then stepped forward into the wind, each heel of her boot clicking against the stairwell in deliberate rhythm, as if scoring a movement only she could hear. Behind her, Cheryl finally exhaled, her face pale, her clipboard hanging loosely at her side. In the stillness that followed, the shorter officer looked at the taller one and murmured, "She owns the airline." The taller one didn't look surprised anymore. He simply nodded, his voice barely audible. "Yes, she does." As Zarya stepped down the metal stairs onto the tarmac, the brisk Zurich air greeted her like a reset, sharp, clarifying, devoid of pretense. Her boots touched down one by one with quiet authority, the sounds lost in the hum of engines and distant baggage carts. Behind her, the door of the aircraft remained open just long enough for Cheryl to reappear briefly at the top of the stairwell, still gripping her clipboard like a lifeline, eyes wide and uncertain. She didn't speak, perhaps afraid that anything she said might further unmask the power dynamic that had just reversed in a single, quiet act. Zarya didn't look back. She walked steadily toward the terminal, where a private car and 2 agents from Langford's Zurich office waited to escort her, not because she asked, but because the protocols now belonged to her. Meanwhile, on the plane, the cabin was no longer the same vessel that had once carried casual cruelty so freely. Word had begun to spread among the remaining crew who were finalizing cabin checks. It started as a whisper between 2 junior flight attendants. "She's on the board." One of them held a printed itinerary that had been marked for follow-up, and now saw the name highlighted in a pale blue tag that denoted executive tier access. The color coding they had overlooked before now burned on the page like a warning. Cheryl remained standing in the forward galley, stunned into stillness until Robert, the cabin manager, emerged from the cockpit hallway, brows furrowed, unaware of what had just occurred. "What's going on?" "We've got final reports to file," he said, scanning the crew for answers. Cheryl opened her mouth, but found no words. Instead, it was Elliot, the younger steward who had spoken to Zarya during the initial seating incident, who finally stepped forward. He pulled up a crewside tablet and accessed the flight log, entering an override code. Within moments, the interface flashed open to a red flag personnel review screen, tied directly to Zarya's passenger profile. Not a threat flag, not a watch list tag, but a review audit flag marked with a diamond symbol. Internal use only. Robert stepped closer and saw it. "She's not just a passenger," Elliot said quietly. "She's the new oversight stakeholder. Tier 1. She owns the board seat Langford Aviation, just added." Robert paled. Just then, the cockpit door clicked open and out stepped Captain Marek, the pilot, a quiet but respected veteran of 30 years. He hadn't been involved in the previous chaos. His focus had been flight systems, schedules, and landing clearance. He looked around at the frozen crew, noticed the tension, and finally said, "Why is everyone standing like we lost pressurization midair?" Robert turned toward him. "Captain, we may have just violated about 10 levels of policy." "What kind of policy?" Marek asked. Cheryl finally spoke up. "The passenger in 1A Zarya Monroe. We moved her. We questioned her. We reported her to Zurich Customs." Marek frowned. "And she's not just a passenger," Elliot said again. "She's the majority stakeholder who just bought the controlling interest in Langford Aviation last week." The silence that followed was deeper than turbulence. At that same moment, in the business class cabin, separated from the rest by a frosted divider and an unassuming silver curtain, sat a man who had been watching the last hour unfold in real time. His name was Reginald Keene, interim CEO of Langford Aviation Global. He had boarded anonymously, using a discreet diplomatic manifest code, and was seated in 3B with nothing but a briefcase and a set of high-end noise-canceling headphones that had long since been removed. In front of him was a sleek display built into the seat console, typically reserved for entertainment. Except Keene's had been quietly rewired for internal surveillance. His assistant, Monica Vance, sat one row behind, disguised in business attire, but silently taking notes on a tablet that recorded timestamps, voices, and behavioral markers. Keene watched Cheryl retreat from the door. He watched Zarya descend the stairs. He watched the digital logs flash with violation notices and unchecked microaggressions logged by the cabin's internal behavioral recognition software, a beta system he had once shelved, now very much reactivated. He didn't speak until Monica leaned forward and whispered, "Should we initiate post-flight disciplinary reviews?" He tapped his fingers once on the console. "No," he said softly. "Initiate full systems audit. We're done patching holes. It's time to rebuild the vessel." Monica raised an eyebrow. "You mean retrain?" "No," Keene replied. "I still locked on the screen. I mean redesign. From hiring practices to in-flight engagement protocols to the way we define respect in a closed cabin at 30,000 feet. She just gave us the perfect case study." Monica nodded, her stylus pausing only once before she typed. "Executive directive confirmed systemic overhaul authorized." Keene leaned back. "Get me every training log from the last 6 months. And find out who made the call to strip food service from her row. Monica looked up. Already flagged. Cheryl. Good, Keene said, his voice almost a whisper now. Let's see if she wants to reapply for her job, after she learns what dignity means from the woman she tried to humiliate. Back on the tarmac, Zarya stepped into the waiting black sedan without a single word. The driver didn't need instruction. The route was already programmed, direct to the Zurich Grand, where the Langford Executive Suite had been pre-cleared. As the vehicle pulled away, Zarya stared out the window, her reflection ghosting against the skyline. She didn't smile. There was no satisfaction, no gloating. Only calm, only quiet. Because justice, when it finally arrives on its own terms, doesn't need to raise its voice. Within 48 hours of Flight 724's landing in Zurich, a formal memo was issued from the Langford Aviation Global Executive Suite. It carried the subject line "Immediate Personnel Actions Following Internal Investigation, Flight 724, and its contents were as surgical as they were devastating. The memo, sent to all departmental heads and senior HR officers, detailed a comprehensive response rooted not in public relations posturing, but in structural correction. A zero-tolerance clause had been activated, one that had existed on paper for years but never been enforced with such precision. Cheryl Mathers, the lead flight attendant whose voice had echoed over the intercom naming Zarya Monroe as a passenger of concern, was immediately suspended without pay pending disciplinary review. The formal language in the documentation referred to behavioral bias resulting in systemic breach of policy, dereliction of duty, and public exposure of confidential passenger movement. She was ordered to report to Langford's Diversity and Conduct Retraining Center in Amsterdam within 5 days or be terminated. Robert Klein, the cabin manager who had allowed and sanctioned Zarya's demotion to row 35 under vague protocol, was placed under administrative leave. His internal record, once pristine, was now marked by a red-level infraction. He was to be reassigned, if retained at all, to Langford's new Global Equity Unit, not as a manager, but as a trainee, undergoing a 12-week immersive workshop titled Rebuilding Respect, Operationalizing Equity in Aviation. 3 additional crew members, including Elliot, who had initially voiced discomfort but failed to escalate concerns, were given formal reprimands. However, due to Elliot's post-flight statement in which he acknowledged Zarya's status and attempted to stop further action once aware, his disciplinary measures were lighter. He was placed on a monitored compliance track and temporarily transferred to ground operations at Heathrow, where he would shadow passenger assistance teams specializing in accessibility and bias prevention. But the most striking blow did not land within Langford Aviation's employment network. It landed in the lap of one Mr. William Hargrove, the platinum status passenger in 6D who had falsely claimed he'd seen Zarya linger suspiciously near row 4. His brief testimony, spoken casually to cabin crew mid-flight, had become a keystone in the justification for escalating her scrutiny. What Hargrove hadn't anticipated, however, was that Langford had recently partnered with a third-party onboard surveillance compliance firm. As part of the airline's AI-assisted monitoring pilot program, discrete motion logs were generated for every aisle movement and time-stamped against passenger seat location data, not for public surveillance, but for claims dispute, safety validation, and passenger protection. Footage from Flight 724's mid-cabin camera revealed Hargrove had never even turned his head toward row 4 during boarding. His eyes remained fixed on his phone, his bag already stowed, his tray table down. His claim wasn't just inaccurate, it was fabricated. And under Langford's newly enforced misinformation policy, any passenger who knowingly made a false allegation resulting in reputational harm or safety disruption was subject to civil litigation and blacklisting across Langford's global travel network. The formal letter of notification was hand-delivered to Hargrove's residence in Boston. It outlined a pending defamation suit, with damages sought for the stress and operational disruption caused to a senior executive during protected travel. More immediate, however, was the permanent revocation of his flight privileges. Effective immediately, he was banned from all Langford Aviation routes and those of its 12 airline partners. His frequent flyer miles were voided. His platinum tier was dissolved. Attempts to book under alternate names would trigger a no-fly flag within the partner system. Media never picked up the story, not because it lacked substance, but because Langford didn't need to grandstand. Justice wasn't about spectacle anymore. It was about infrastructure. Quiet, precise, documented action. Inside the company, news of the disciplinary wave traveled fast. Employees who had long whispered about the performative nature of Langford's equity promises now saw something real. Compliance teams began reviewing passenger engagement logs. Internal chat boards once filled with flight gossip and crew swaps shifted tone. Training modules were updated. Language was revised. Where once there had been ambiguity, now there was definition. Bias had always been real, but now it had consequences. In Amsterdam, Cheryl sat in a classroom-sized conference room with 14 other staff members from Langford and its partner airlines. The nameplate on her desk read, Reintegration Candidate Number 073 LAG. The room was sterile, the air still, the facilitator's voice calm but unyielding. On the screen at the front, a module played. Situational Empathy in Cabin Service. A line appeared in bold. You are not just hired to fly. You are trusted to see. Cheryl stared at it. Her fingers clutched around a pen she hadn't used. A week ago, she had been sure of her place. Now, she didn't know which part of her job still belonged to her. Back in London, Elliot was shadowing a passenger liaison named Mercy, an older woman who had spent the last decade helping disabled and elderly travelers navigate Heathrow's chaos. Mercy was kind, efficient, but didn't tolerate shortcuts. When Elliot asked if he could skip the daily empathy logs, she raised an eyebrow. You skipped one kind of seeing already, she said, and it cost someone her humanity for 8 hours. You want to skip again? Elliot didn't ask twice. Robert, meanwhile, sat in front of a regional HR panel. He had prepared notes, rebuttals, explanations. But when he looked at the faces across the table, all of whom had read the same flight log reports, watched the same timeline footage, and heard the same passenger silence, he realized no explanation would change what had happened. A single sentence ended his statement. I assumed she'd escalate if she really had authority. The room went quiet. One panelist wrote down the words verbatim. Assumption had become policy, and now policy had teeth. At Langford HQ, Zaria's name was added to the Executive Oversight Directory. Her first scheduled address would take place the following week, during Langford's annual Equity and Experience Summit in Berlin. The title of her talk was already circulating among department heads, Dignity in Transit, Why Quiet Power Changes Everything. The itinerary noted that she would be introduced by Reginald Keane himself. Outside the Zurich terminal, a new sign had been installed at the staff entrance. Simple, silver, etched with only 5 words. Your uniform does not absolve you. The lobby of Langford Aviation's New York headquarters pulsed with quiet order, its marble floors polished to mirror finish. The glass-paneled elevators carrying senior executives and ground staff in seamless, disciplined motion. At the far end, past the executive wing, where policy meetings and board decisions shaped the future of the skies, stood Office 27C, a private suite recently renovated for one of the board's newest, but most impactful members. Inside, Zaria sat at a walnut desk, softened by sunlight pouring through slanted blinds, her fingers quietly flipping through a proposal packet for the Langford Youth Initiative, a new program aimed at funding global mentorship in aviation and the arts. It was quiet, but not peaceful. The weight of leadership, even when earned, rarely came without friction. A soft knock broke the stillness. Zaria looked up. Her assistant opened the door halfway and said gently, There's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's important. Claudia Summers. Zaria's face didn't change, but her eyes held still for a moment longer than usual. Send her in, she said calmly. Claudia stepped in hesitantly, no longer in uniform. Her outfit was modest, intentionally so, an oatmeal sweater, loose slacks, hair pulled back into a tight, unassuming bun. She held nothing in her hands but a single folder, gripped at the edge as if anchoring herself with it. Ms. Monroe, she began, voice low but clear, thank you for seeing me. I wasn't sure you would. Zaria closed the folder in front of her and gestured to the chair across the desk. Claudia sat carefully, posture straight but uncertain, like someone still deciding if they were allowed to exist in the room. "I've spent the last month in Amsterdam," Claudia began, "at the retraining facility. I've been going through the full track: bias deconstruction, empathy labs, accountability panels. I've listened to recordings of myself from that flight more times than I can count. I hear things now I couldn't hear then. The tone, the silence, the choices I made without realizing I was choosing." She paused, her hands tightening slightly around the folder. "I know what I did. I know I was wrong." Zarya didn't interrupt. She simply waited. "I'm not here to beg for my job back," Claudia continued. "I'm not sure I want it. What I do want is to do something that matters, something that repairs a fraction of what I helped break." She placed the folder on the desk and slid it towards Zarya. "I've applied to be a volunteer at the East Harlem Music Conservatory, your program for underprivileged youth. I have no musical training, but I'm certified in child safety, group logistics, and resource coordination. I figured maybe, if I could help with transportation, food, scheduling, anything that doesn't involve standing in front of a cabin with authority I didn't deserve." Zarya looked at the folder, but didn't open it. She let the silence stretch, not as punishment, but as reflection. Then she spoke, voice soft but anchored. "Do you remember what you said to me when I asked for a blanket?" Claudia nodded slowly. "I do." "Do you remember how you looked at me when that man accused me of stealing?" Claudia's voice cracked slightly. "I remember all of it." Zarya leaned back in her chair, eyes steady. "I don't need you to feel guilty. Guilt fades. It softens over time. It lets people sleep again. What I need is for you to understand that every child who walks into that conservatory, every little girl who looks like me, every boy who's told he's not polished enough for the violin, every student who's assumed to be less before they even play a note, they walk into a world already tilted against them. And sometimes the people standing in the way aren't villains. They're gatekeepers who never stop to question why the gate existed in the first place." Claudia swallowed hard. "I want to be better. I don't want to be the person I was on that plane." Zarya studied her for a long moment, then finally opened the folder. Inside were references, safety certifications, a handwritten essay titled "Learning to Listen Without Judgment," and a scheduled proposal for after-school volunteer sessions. It was meticulous, humble, and quietly hopeful. Zarya closed it gently. "You'll start with 3 hours a week," she said. "You'll assist logistics only. No direct mentoring until the kids ask for it. They're better at reading people than we are." Claudia blinked, caught between gratitude and something deeper. "Thank you," she said, her voice a whisper. Zarya stood, walking to the small window that overlooked the avenue. "I forgive you," she said after a beat. "Not because you deserve it, but because those kids deserve to see someone who failed learn how to get up again. That's how they'll learn that falling isn't the end of the story." Claudia sat frozen, her eyes glistening. Zarya turned back, a faint warmth in her expression now. "But don't mistake forgiveness for forgetfulness. You'll earn every moment you're there. Not for me, for them." Claudia nodded, rising slowly. "I understand." As she left the office, passing the glass-paneled hallway where portraits of Langford's current board members now hung, she paused briefly in front of Zarya's frame. It was a striking image. Zarya poised with her cello beside her, eyes forward, unwavering. Claudia took a breath, then continued walking. And in that quiet, long corridor lined with legacy, a new kind of history began to write itself, not in announcements or punishments, but in service, in redemption, in showing up even after you've been wrong. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more powerful narratives just like this. What part of Zarya's journey hit you the hardest? Was it the silent injustice, the quiet revenge, or the final act of forgiveness? Tell us in the comments below. What would you have done in her place? And while you're at it, let us know where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories reach.